The story begins far from the roaring front lines, on a cold, salt-bitten stretch of coast where the Pacific tide curled against breakwaters like a restless animal. It was 1943, and Japan stood at a brutal crossroads. Once unstoppable, the Imperial Navy was now bleeding ships at a pace that frightened even its most seasoned admirals. American submarines prowled the sea lanes like silent predators, ripping apart convoys, draining fuel, food, and steel from a nation already stretched thin. In Tokyo's dimly lit naval design rooms, the atmosphere felt unsteady, like the air before an earthquake. Maps lay scattered across long tables, marked with red slashes where tankers had vanished beneath torpedo wakes. Each disappearance arrived with the weight of inevitability. Another convoy ambushed, another lifeline severed. The war was shifting beneath Japan's feet, and everyone knew it. Everyone except one small group of men who refused to accept collapse as a foregone conclusion. They were engineers, naval architects, physicists, acoustic specialists, people whose weapons were equations, soldering irons, and sleepless nights. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Hajime Fukui, was a quiet man with a scholar's posture and eyes that held the inward burning intensity of someone who saw patterns where others saw chaos. His colleagues respected him, admirals tolerated him, and the war, indifferent as always, would demand everything from him. Fukui understood the Pacific differently than the strategists who studied fleet movements from mahogany offices. To him, the ocean was not an empty void, but a living domain of sound, an endless cathedral of echoes, pressure, and vibration. He knew that ships made their presence known long before searchlights touched them. Propellers churned the sea in distinct rhythms, engines throbbed at frequencies that traveled miles. Sound was information. Sound was opportunity. And in 1943, opportunity had become rare enough to worship. The idea he presented to the Naval Technical Department was as audacious as it was desperate. A torpedo that could hear, not simply track by wake or pattern run, but listen, using hydrophones tuned to the heartbeat of a ship's propellers. A weapon that, once unleashed, would hunt its target with the patience of a predator and the precision of a mathematician. Many dismissed the concept outright. Japan had excelled in torpedo technology early in the war. The Type 93 Long Lance was the envy of every navy. But its engineers were now overtasked, its resources strained, its factories bombed to rubble. Developing an acoustic torpedo required electronics, power supplies, specialized sensors, components increasingly difficult to obtain. Some senior officers argued it was a fantasy. Others whispered that it was too late for fantasies. Fukui disagreed. He believed that in war, physics cared nothing for desperation. Equations remained loyal long after strategy faltered. And so he made his case with the calm conviction of a man who felt the future pulling at his sleeve. Imagine, he told them, a torpedo that doesn't chase where a ship was, but where it is. One that follows the music of its machinery. One that forces enemy captains to fear their own engines. The room fell silent. For a moment, even skepticism hesitated. Permission was granted, not with enthusiasm, but with the weary hope of men running out of alternatives. The team established their lab near Yokosuka, where the docks groaned with half-repaired destroyers and the metallic scent of welding filled the air. The engineers worked in a long, low building whose windows rattled each time a distant bomb detonated. Inside, their world shrank to a maze of wires, tubes, calibration rigs, and test tanks that shimmered like polished steel under the dim lamps. The first months were grueling. Hydrophones were maddeningly sensitive. One engineer compared them to trying to build a violin that can hear its own strings snapping. Every time they solved one problem, 3 more revealed themselves. Electrical interference scrambled the signal. Seawater corroded the delicate membranes. And worse, sound underwater did not travel in straight lines. It bent, refracted, scattered. What the torpedo heard was not always what existed. Some nights the men worked until dawn. Other nights they didn't stop at all. Sleep became optional. Frustration became familiar. Yet in the midst of this exhaustion, moments of wonder appeared. The first time their prototype sensor captured the rhythmic churn of a destroyer's propellers from 3 kilometers away, they cheered like sailors catching sight of home. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As winter gave way to spring, the torpedo began to take shape, not just as a machine, but as an idea made solid through stubbornness and brilliance. Fukui rarely raised his voice, but he pushed his team relentlessly. Not harshly, but with the quiet force of someone who understood what defeat would truly mean for their families, their nation, and the men fighting in distant waters. By mid-1944, the prototype, nicknamed Kokaku, or Shell of Sound, was ready for open water trials. They took it to Sagami Bay at dusk, when the wind softened and the sea turned the color of dark mercury. A single target vessel, an aging auxiliary ship, cruised along a set path while the engineers watched from a camouflaged test ship. The bay smelled of brine and engine oil, and the air carried a hush as if the ocean itself were listening. "Arming circuit engaged," one technician whispered. Fukui didn't respond. His attention was fixed on the torpedo, a long, sleek shape resting in its launch cradle, its nose fitted with the experimental acoustic array. It looked unassuming, almost too simple for the weight it carried. The order was given. With a hiss like a snake exhaling, the torpedo slid into the sea. At first, nothing happened. The water lay calm, reflecting the fading light. The auxiliary ship continued its slow, deliberate run. Seconds passed with the agonizing pace of a heartbeat monitored in a hospital ward. Then the tracking graph fluttered. A faint line appeared, a signature, a rhythm, a pulse. The torpedo had heard something. It turned toward the sound with a slow, deliberate arc. The ocean swallowed it whole, but its presence remained, recorded by the instruments on the test ship. Every adjustment it made sent a ripple of awe across the deck. The engineers leaned closer. One held his breath. Another began to pray under it. The torpedo altered course again. Its speed increased. It was closing the distance. But 40 seconds into the run, the trace wavered. The ocean grew noisy, full of echoes. Temperature shifts bent the sound waves. The torpedo hesitated, confused by the underwater acoustics that had always defied precise prediction. It corrected, overcorrected, tried again. And then, silence. Not the silence of failure, but the silence of arrival. A roaring column of water erupted beside the auxiliary ship. The blast rolled across the surface with the thunderous confidence of destiny catching up with fear. Debris rained down, and the target vessel shuddered, listing sharply as smoke billowed upward. The engineers stared. None spoke. The torpedo had not simply struck. It had hunted. The next days were spent in feverish refinement, correcting the errors, tuning the sensors, strengthening the circuitry. But the truth was undeniable. Japan had built a weapon that could listen. A torpedo that turned the vulnerability of engine noise into a death sentence. Word of the breakthrough spread through the Naval Ministry like a spark racing across dry grass. Some hailed it as a miracle. Others worried it had come too late to shift the tide. But everyone understood its significance. A weapon like this could shred enemy morale, disrupt American convoy strategy, force submarine commanders to reconsider every sound their vessels produced. It could change the geometry of the Pacific, and yet, for Fukui, the triumph carried a strange aftertaste. Each time he watched the torpedo run its path, he felt a tightening in his chest. It was not guilt. He had long accepted the realities of war, but something subtler, like hearing an echo from the future. Weapons that listen, he thought, have a way of hearing more than their makers intend. Summer 1944 pressed in with heavy heat. The war darkened. Bombers droned overhead often enough that their shadows became familiar shapes on the workshop floors. But inside the Yokosuka lab, work continued with a quiet, intense purpose. Engineers refined the guidance system, improved the battery output, strengthened the warhead casing. Step by step, the weapon evolved into something leaner, sharper, more confident in its own murderous intelligence. Fukui knew the Americans were also working on acoustic torpedoes. Intelligence reports suggested they had prototypes in the Atlantic. That knowledge pushed him harder. This was no longer just about survival. It was a race between two nations listening through the chaos of war for the same dangerous idea. And the Pacific, vast and unforgiving, was about to become the proving ground. As the last notes of summer faded, the first operational batch of the acoustic torpedo, now designated the Type 91 Mod 3, was loaded onto submarines preparing for silent departure into a sea increasingly dominated by American radar and air patrols. The crews handled the new torpedoes with a mixture of reverence and dread. They knew they were carrying something unprecedented. They also knew that Japan's future was hanging by threads too thin to see. And somewhere deep inside the design building, Fukui watched the final crates being sealed. The lights flickered overhead. The floor vibrated with distant explosions. Yet the sound he focused on was softer, almost fragile. The wooden hammer tapping each crate shut, enclosing within it a weapon forged in desperation, brilliance, and the stubborn will to alter the course of a fading war. He wondered if the ocean would accept what they had created, or if it would change everything. By the time the Type 91 Mod 3 reached operational cruise, the Pacific had transformed into a gauntlet of steel, flame, and silence. Japanese submarines that once roamed with aggressive confidence were now forced into the role of hunted things, slipping beneath thermal layers and drifting motionless for hours to avoid the American destroyers that prowled above like wolves circling a wounded stag. The ocean, once their domain, had become a dark labyrinth where each sound carried the weight of consequence. Lieutenant Commander Fukui watched these deployments with a tension he kept hidden behind his quiet expression. The engineers stayed behind while the submariners pushed outward, bearing the torpedoes like offerings to the war's relentless appetite. Weeks passed. Reports trickled in, thin, brittle, incomplete. Some submarines never returned, others returned damaged. But one name appeared again and again in coded transmissions: I-48. I-48 was commanded by Captain Tomozo Kuwahara, a man known for a calm so absolute it unsettled even his peers. Before each patrol, he spoke to his crew not with speeches but with the steady assurance of someone who understood the sea as both adversary and confidant. He accepted the acoustic torpedoes without hesitation. He did not celebrate innovation. He simply recognized necessity. His mission in late 1944 was brutal in scope break through the expanding web of American anti-submarine forces, intercept a fast-moving resupply group near the Palau Islands, and cripple at least one of its destroyer escorts. It was the kind of assignment that felt less like strategy and more like a test of endurance against probability. The submarine left port under a sky streaked with low-gray clouds, the kind that seemed to cling to the horizon with reluctant fingers. As I-48 slid beneath the waves, the ocean swallowed the last sliver of sunlight glinting off its hull. Down in the control room, the electric hum of instruments mingled with the faint murmur of men bracing for the days of tension to come. For the first week, Kuwahara ran deep and slow, conserving battery power and keeping his crew on edge, but not exhausted. He knew fatigue led to mistakes, and mistakes led to death. The men whispered of American destroyers that could detect a periscope wake at miles of distance, of aircraft whose radar reached through storms like a hand searching for prey. Yet they trusted their captain. And they trusted the new torpedo, though none had yet heard it in action. When the first hint of their target appeared, it was little more than a subtle change in the hydrophone readings. A low, steady beat, faint, but unmistakably rhythmic. The sound cut through the ambient hush of the deep, like the pulse of a creature too large to imagine. The operator leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Propeller noise," he said softly. "Fast, multiple screws." Kuwahara moved beside him, listening through the headphones. The vibrations thrummed against his skull, distant, deliberate, powerful. An American destroyer escort. The sea around them felt suddenly alive with tension. Every man in the control room sensed it. This was the moment the engineers had dreamed of and feared. A weapon that hunted by sound would soon meet a target that defined itself by noise. But destroyers were never alone. If they were close enough to hear, then I-48 was close enough to be heard. Kuwahara ordered the submarine to descend another 60 meters. The hull creaked as pressure gripped it, a sound like distant thunder rolling through iron. Lights dimmed. The crew reduced movement to brief, quiet gestures. Even conversation became sparse, replaced by glances and unspoken calculations. The destroyer's rhythm grew louder, clearer. Now they could distinguish the propeller blades slicing water in rapid rotation. Another tone joined it. A second vessel, possibly a third. A convoy group, just as intelligence predicted. Kuwahara studied the chart table. The enemy formation was moving south-southwest. Their own position placed them slightly ahead, at a narrowing angle. It was a dangerous approach, but offered the one thing Japanese submarines still relied upon: the element of surprise. He turned to the weapons officer and gave the smallest nod. "Prepare the acoustic torpedoes." Below deck, torpedo technicians opened the storage compartment. The weapons lay there in metal cradles, their polished noses catching the dim red emergency lighting. The technicians handled them carefully, aware that the delicate electronics inside were both miracle and liability. They armed the magnetic detonators, checked the guide wires, confirmed the battery charge. One man whispered a prayer under his breath. Another touched the torpedo as if acknowledging a living thing. Back in the control room, the hydrophone operator stiffened. Destroyer accelerating. Their sweep pattern changed. Kuwahara didn't need the explanation. The Americans had spotted something, perhaps a ripple, a faint engine note, or nothing more than a suspicion sharpened by months of combat. Destroyers did not require certainty to attack. They required opportunity. The bow's sonar ping pierced the water like a blade. Even the air inside the submarine seemed to tighten. Men held their breath without realizing it. Kuwahara remained composed. The ocean was now a chessboard, and he had been maneuvering toward this fragile advantage for days. He ordered a slow rise to periscope depth, careful enough that not even a bubble trail would betray them. The periscope pierced the surface for fewer than 4 seconds. In that brief sweep, Kuwahara saw the convoy. 3 destroyer escorts, a cluster of supply ships, and the shimmering trace of their wakes illuminated beneath the moonlight like scars on silver skin. The lead destroyer was moving fast, perhaps heading toward the submarine's last known position. Its bow sliced the waves cleanly, throwing white spray into the night wind. A perfect target. Kuwahara lowered the periscope and murmured the firing order. The first torpedo left the tube with a muted rush. The second followed moments later. The control room filled with the soft ticking of timers counting the glide phase before the acoustic circuits engaged. On the hydrophones, the operators listened intently. Then the torpedoes awakened. Their guidance arrays bloomed into life, drawing in the surrounding soundscape with sudden hunger. On the chart table, their trajectories curved, not mechanically but organically, adjusting in small increments, as if sniffing the water for their quarry. The men watched the tracking graph with a reverence normally reserved for divine signs. The torpedoes veered toward the destroyer's engine note. The Americans realized too late. A frantic burst of engine noise erupted through the hydrophones, the destroyer accelerating, turning sharply. Depth charges splashed into the water with heavy, echoing plumes. One exploded close enough to send a tremor through I-48's hull, rattling instruments, knocking dust from overhead pipes. A junior crewman flinched, biting down on a curse. The torpedoes continued, their path bent smoothly, unwavering. The hydrophone registered a rising crescendo, the destroyer's propellers spinning harder, clawing for escape. But noise was its enemy now. The torpedoes were drawn to it with relentless precision. A single monstrous detonation fractured the sea. The shockwave rolled across I-48 like a tidal heartbeat, shaking the vessel from bow to stern. Equipment rattled. A wrench fell somewhere below, clanging once before silence returned. The hydrophone operator stared at his console, eyes wide. "Impact confirmed," he whispered. But there was more. A second blast, deeper and more violent, erupted as the second torpedo struck the crippled destroyer's aft section. Through the submarine's steel bones, they felt the distant agony of metal being torn apart. A long, low groan of a ship splitting under its own weight. Then, the unmistakable roar of collapsing bulkheads. Kuwahara allowed himself a single breath of relief. But the battle was not finished. The remaining destroyers turned toward the sound of the explosion, launching into aggressive pursuit. Their search patterns tightened. Sonar pings stabbed the water with furious rhythm. I-48 descended to its maximum safe depth, where darkness thickened and the weight of the ocean pressed so heavily against the hull that every man felt it in his chest. The enemy began their counterattack. Depth charge after depth charge plunged into the deep. The blasts came like the pounding of a giant fist against the submarine's iron skin. Bulbs shattered. A pipe split, spraying cold water across the floor. One crewman lost his footing and struck his head, but even dazed, he clung to his duty station. Kuwahara kept the submarine steady. He whispered no reassurance. His steadiness was reassurance enough. Hours passed in this suspended torment. Each explosion was a question. Are you still alive? Each silence threatened to be the one that preceded final destruction. Yet dawn eventually crept across the ocean above, softening the American pursuit. The destroyers shifted their pattern, then finally withdrew to protect the convoy. They had lost one of their own and gained no certainty of the submarine's fate. When the hydrophone at last fell silent, the crew sagged in exhausted relief, but none felt triumph, only survival. I-48 limped away under cover of darkness, its batteries low, its hull dented, its crew hollow-eyed. Yet inside its torpedo room lay two empty cradles, silent testament to a weapon that had fulfilled its terrible purpose with deadly elegance. News of the attack reached Yokosuka through encrypted transmission. Fukui read the report alone in his office. The destroyer had sunk within minutes. Survivors were few. The Americans had reacted with fury and confusion, unsure what had struck them. The torpedoes had worked, but Fukui felt no elation. Only the quiet, solemn recognition that something irreversible had occurred. The ocean had accepted the weapon, and now it would demand its due. In the waning months of the war, the Pacific seemed to exhale in long, exhausted breaths. Storms built over its vast heart with restless energy, and currents shifted with a slow, spectral force. The sea had watched nations rise and collide, had swallowed fleets whole, had been carved by the wakes of ships that no longer existed. And now, as 1945 unfurled like a fraying banner, it carried the last echoes of a conflict approaching its terrible end. Lieutenant Commander Hajime Fukui felt those echoes in every message that arrived from the front. Submarine losses mounted. Convoy routes collapsed. Japan's naval strength, once fearsome enough to intimidate entire oceans, had thinned to scattered hulls struggling to stay afloat. Shipyards had fallen silent, their cranes motionless against smoky skies. Factories flickered in and out of operation, crippled by shortages and air raids. Yet amidst this slow disintegration, his acoustic torpedo continued to emerge in after-action reports, sometimes as a footnote, sometimes as the central miracle of a brief, surprising victory. But always, without exception, its presence carried a strange duality, admiration for its ingenuity, and a shadow, deep and persistent, cast by what it had been built to do. Fukui never forgot that duality. He had created something that did not aim, did not guess, did not mimic. It listened, and listening was a form of understanding. As winter gave way to spring, the Americans learned quickly. Their destroyers began deploying noisemakers, metal cylinders towed behind the ship, emitting a chaotic clatter designed to lure acoustic torpedoes away from the propellers. Some dragged chains through the water to muddle the signature. Others shifted engine speeds unpredictably, trying to confuse the torpedo's sensors. Reaction, adaptation, escalation, the eternal rhythm of war. By the time these countermeasures spread through the fleet, Japan faced a grim reality. The torpedo's effectiveness was shrinking, not because its design faltered, but because the empire around it was collapsing faster than innovation could keep pace. Still, ships like I-48 continued their missions with a resilience that bordered on defiance. Their final chapter would be written in waters north of Okinawa. The order came on a cold, overcast morning. Intercept an American amphibious group preparing for the coming offensive. It was a mission laced with desperation, almost a plea whispered through encrypted code. I-48 departed silently, its hull patched, its crew weary but unwavering. Fukui stood at the harbor as the submarine slipped into deeper waters. He wore no expression that others could read, but inside him, something tightened like a rope pulled slowly around a beam. He felt the war closing in, dismantling the world he knew piece by piece. The engineers who once crowded around drafting tables now worked in shattered rooms lit by lanterns, their tools salvaged from debris. Many had been conscripted into civil defense duties. Others waited for news of family members lost in the bombings. Fukui did what he could to keep the team together, though he sensed the end approaching like a distant wave gathering height. What lingered most was not fear, but a melancholy recognition that their creation, the torpedo that hunted by sound, would outlive the circumstances that had given it birth. In the deep waters near Okinawa, I-48 found its target. It was night. Above the submarine, the sea was churned by the movement of troop transports, escort ships, and landing craft preparing for the assault. The hydrophones captured a symphony of noise. Engines throbbing, propellers gnashing water, machinery humming in overlapping layers. It was overwhelming. Even experienced operators struggled to isolate individual signatures. Kuwahara made his calculations with disciplined calm. The escort destroyers were alert, sweeping aggressively for submarines. Aircraft circled overhead. If I-48 attacked, it would reveal itself instantly, and yet the mission demanded it. Their orders were blunt: strike the invasion force's escort screen, disrupt the landing timetable, and withdraw if possible. Kuwahara whispered the firing commands. 4 torpedoes left their tubes in rapid succession. 2 straight runners, 2 acoustic. Their wakes dissolved into the dark sea. The submarine dove deep, deeper than before, until the hull shuddered under the weight of immense pressure. Above, the destroyers reacted with coordinated fury. The straight-running torpedoes reached first. One missed. One connected with a landing craft support ship, ripping it open with a blast that rolled across the formation like a crack of distant thunder. The convoy staggered, momentarily disoriented. But the acoustic torpedoes were still hunting. The first locked onto a destroyer accelerating to counterattack. Its propellers churned in tight, panicked arcs, but each movement only fed the torpedo more sound, more clarity. The explosion when it struck was sharper, cleaner, a precision that left the ship ablaze from bow to midsection. The second acoustic torpedo veered unexpectedly. The noisemakers deployed by the escorts confused its sensor just long enough for it to catch a new signal, loud, powerful, unshielded. A transport, a ship filled with hundreds of soldiers. The torpedo altered course. Kuwahara realized this seconds too late. The hydrophone operator's face drained of color as the signature clarified. Then a distant blast reverberated through the ocean, a rolling low groan he felt in his bones. Silence followed. Not the silence of stealth, the silence of something irrevocable. American destroyers converged on the point of origin with a momentum that bordered on vengeance. They swept the water with sonar so aggressively the echoes struck I-48 like hammer blows. Depth charges fell in patterns designed not merely to force a submarine to rise or retreat, but to crush it utterly. The first blasts came like iron fists against the hull. Lights flickered, dials trembled. A metal cabinet tore from its bolts and slammed against a bulkhead. The crew braced themselves, gripping rails, clenching teeth, waiting for the next wave. It came, and then the next. Each blast grew closer, sharper, more intimate. Water trickled through a seam that had never leaked before. Men scrambled to patch it, hands shaking but disciplined. Kuwahara issued his final order: steer deeper into the black pressure where even destroyers hesitated to follow. The submarine descended. The hull creaked like an old tree bending toward a storm. Depth gauges shuddered as the needle approached the red zone. Another explosion, closer. The lights died. No one knows precisely when the hull gave way. Perhaps it was the weight of the ocean crushing inward. Perhaps a final depth charge ruptured a seam too critical to survive. But in the deep silence of the Pacific Trench, I-48 vanished without a final signal, without a final breath. News traveled slowly back to Yokosuka. A missing submarine. No survivors, no salvage possible. Fukui received the report in the dim half-light of a damaged office whose windows had been boarded after the last air raid. He read it once, then again, as if repetition could soften its edge. But the truth remained sharp. The torpedoes had worked. The engineering had been sound, the physics indifferent, the ocean honest. The war had simply asked more than any one weapon could answer. In the days that followed, Fukui walked the shoreline near the base, listening to the surf collapse against the rocks. He thought about the men who had carried his invention into battle. He thought about the Americans who had scrambled to counter it. He thought about I-48, now part of the quiet, immense archive of the sea. What he had created would soon be studied by the victors, improved, refined, inherited by a world that was already imagining the next conflict. The acoustic torpedo would not die with the empire that built it. It would become part of the global vocabulary of warfare. Standing at the water's edge, he understood the quiet truth that the war had taught him again and again. Technology does not choose sides. It simply answers the questions humanity asks of it. The tide washed over the stones at his feet. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, destroyers patrolled seas now claimed by another navy. Somewhere below, in the cold quiet where light could not reach, lay the remnants of a submarine that had carried both hope and consequence. In that moment, Fukui bowed his head, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. Of the men who fought, of the machines they trusted, of the ocean that judged everything without malice. The war would end soon. The world would rebuild. And the torpedo that hunted ships by sound would pass into history. Not as a miracle, not as a monster, but as a reminder of what desperation and brilliance can create when the world is unraveling. Because in the end, the ocean hears everything, even the things we never meant it to.